I'm Dr. Amol Gupta, and I want to thank you for joining me on another episode of Medicine Mentors, where we interview masters in medicine, leading physicians at the top universities across the United States to learn from their experiences and derive key insights, traits, and best practices that can guide medical students and residents. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Stacey Rose. She's the Assistant Dean of Clinical Curriculum and part of the faculty of the Internal Medicine Department and Infectious Diseases Department at the Baylor College of Medicine. As a physician leader, educator, and mentor, Dr. Rose has received many national honors and awards from bodies such as the American College of Physicians and the ACGME. She's committed to improving medical education through curriculum development, as well as improving physician wellness. Thank you so much, Dr. Rose, for being on with us today.
It's a pleasure to join you.
Dr. Rose, I want to start by taking you back to your childhood and understand a little bit about your journey from childhood to current.
When reflecting on my childhood, the first folks that come to mind are my parents. And I had incredible role models, continue to have incredible role models as my parents. My father is a physician. He's a cardiologist, and I'll come back to that in a minute. My mom is in education. So she was a math teacher for many years, and then she moved into educational leadership and administration, and later on consulting. So she sort of learned to teach the students and then learned to teach the teachers as her career evolved. I, of course, have two siblings as well, a younger brother and an older sister. And I think that my development as a human being, as the middle child centered between two very capable siblings, and as the child of two very loving, supportive, and accomplished parents, I think I was actually very much poised for success. It's interesting that my dad is a doctor, and a very good one that I would trust with any of my friends or family members. And yet growing up, I actually said I would never be a doctor. He was, hardly ever home for dinners with the family. You could sort of see the stress that he brought home because he cared so much about his patients. And so I actually thought that I was going to do something totally different. I tried to be an actress. Actually, it's probably why I'm comfortable if they ask me about interviews for COVID-19, because my secret dream was actually in acting and TV and movies. And I really tried my hand at that for a while. And it was only in college when I had a gig at an advertising agency, actually, and we were shooting a commercial at Ben Taub at our local county hospital, which is bizarre. That hardly ever happens. It's like the stars aligned. And so we were shooting a commercial. And so I was in the emergency room at Ben Taub, not as a doctor, not as a student, not as a volunteer, but as part of this advertising agency. And I sort of had that vantage point and thought, wow, this Spanish-speaking mom is having a lot of trouble communicating with the doctor as to what's wrong with her kid. I speak Spanish. That was part of my training in college. And I'd really love to help this situation. And so it was sort of from that vantage point that I came into medicine a little bit on the backside.
I want to talk about some challenges that you faced, and probably specifically the challenge when you maneuvered mid-path from going into acting to coming into medicine and becoming a doctor.
I think that early on, there was definitely a learning curve. I can remember sitting in classes having to do with biochemistry and metabolism, and we had a really great educator who would elaborately draw out pathways in real time with chalk, and we would sort of check it out. And I remember thinking, this is review for most of you. I have never seen this material. Like, I have no idea what this is. And yet, I actually think in a lot of ways, I had an advantage as someone who had a little bit more sort of maturity and conscientiousness and intention around my education. I had sort of seen other things and thought, well, no, this is what I want to do. And so I'm just going to put in the time and resources in order to get that content under my belt. And once I felt like I was able to successfully navigate that new content, then the rest sort of fell into place. And I no longer felt disadvantaged in any way, really beyond MS1 year, because at that point, I think the humanities side of medicine is just as important as the ability to wrestle with basic science content. And plus, I think, again, and I'm not saying you can't have enthusiasm for medicine if you come from it from another angle, but I do think I was particularly poised to be enthusiastic about learning. And so that carried through into the clinical years as well. And it was like, now I actually get to see this Spanish-speaking patient in front of me who I can actually help. And sort of putting that all together was invigorating.
I want to talk to you a little bit about the work that you've done in physician wellness. Today, there seems to be more burnout and more stress, and people are less happy. Can you talk to us a little bit about, what is this burnout?
I think it's in many ways people relate the burnout to there's a tremendous amount of workload, although I think that was actually already there, right? I mean, you talk about the house officers from days of yore. That term house officers was because they lived there. They lived at the hospital. That was literally their life in residency. So let's not pretend that years ago residents weren't also very burdened with workload and physicians weren't already burdened with workload. So I think it's really incumbent upon us as educators to not just acknowledge that these are challenges, but to actually help our students and learners and colleagues develop and implement strategies that can protect us from those ills. And so I'll give you an example. When I supervise residents in my clinic, there are some days where the teaching point is directly related to the patient care issue at hand. Okay, look, this person prescribed a proton pump inhibitor, but that is contraindicated because of the HIV medication that this person is on. They're not going to absorb it. That's a perfectly fine teaching issue that we can talk about. But maybe the next patient, there's not necessarily a particular teaching issue having to do with their diagnosis or therapeutics that I want to impart. But maybe that's an opportunity to talk about how, look, this patient used to not be compliant at all. And it's taken us years. This person has a personality disorder. It's taken us years to develop a therapeutic relationship. And look at how her viral load has improved. She sends me lots of MyChart messages, and I have to set boundaries with her in order to make sure that this relationship is going to work for both of us. But when you do that and you set boundaries and you're honest with your patients, even those who others might see as challenging can be a source of strength and pride for you as a clinician when you have a successful outcome. So it's like that kind of teaching point is really important because when they go off into practice, they too need to be intentional about marking their success as a human being and as a doctor in order to be able to sustain themselves in the profession with well-being.
Can you share with us any initiatives that you've taken to address burnout and improve physician wellness?
Absolutely. So we put together several formal initiatives, mostly in the purview of the residency program. I had a formal role as the wellness director, and many of those projects are still ongoing. But probably the one that we're most proud of, and that we do hope to publish someday when we get around to it, has to do with the grant program that we were lucky enough to be a part of through ACGME. And they had put out a call for this back to bedside initiative. There were 30 funded projects. Baylor College of Medicine had one of them. And the project is called Humanism Rounds. And so the idea is normally when you go on rounds as a team in the afternoon, you're focused on, okay, person in bed 3A with congestive heart failure, status post workup, and we determined that it was non-ischemic. And so we're going to diurese the patient and electrolytes look good today, and then they're going to go home tomorrow, right? That's kind of the situation on rounds. And so we thought, well, what if we actually took a more deliberate approach to getting to know our patients as human beings? And the residents who helped to implement this project actually then came up with a dedicated human history. So they came up with an acronym to help the residents learn how to actually learn about their patients, like what TV programs do you watch? Do you play an instrument? Who are the people in your life that support you? And those sorts of questions to help frame a patient as a human being and not just as a disease. And then the idea for Humanism Rounds, which is part of the project, is that you go back to the bedside after you've taken care of the, quote, clinical aspects of their care for the day, that you take an opportunity, maybe not every patient every day, we recognize everybody's busy, but either as a team or as an individual to go back and really sit down with that patient and focus on their human side. And then once a month, the group gets each pavilion has like a celebration. We usually bring some cookies and we allow the residents to sort of reflect on their experiences on Humanism Rounds during the month. And it's been really impactful on the way that residents interpret their role, right? It's very different to take care of somebody with congestive heart failure who you also know is a grandma who's trying to get out of the hospital for their grandchild's high school graduation. That's a very different interaction than looking just at their sodium and potassium and their weight. So I think it's helped people kind of get back connected with why they went into medicine, which is to help people.
One of the focuses that you have is in innovation in education and active education or active learning. So can you share with us what is innovation in curriculum? What is active learning? and share some initiatives that you've taken in this space.
So I think a lot of curricula across the country are moving towards more active formats of learning. That is transitioning from the traditional sage on the stage, as they call it, to a guide on the side. I love that analogy, right? So rather than me at the front of a room telling you facts about microbiology that you need to memorize, actually finding ways to engage you as the learner and as the driver of your own learning. That's really what active learning is all about. And I think one of the most helpful ways to open these sorts of conversations is to think about, when's the last time you really learned something well? Like, when's the last time you acquired a new knowledge base, and how did you acquire it? Was it really from a lecture? Probably not. So that concept of being a lifelong learner and a teacher are absolutely paired. I think the concept of active learning is having the learner be engaged and actually driving their own learning. So it is a balance. I'm not saying there's not a role for some lectures, but more and more, I think we're trying to find ways to make our educational sessions as sort of engaging and learner-centric as possible.
I want to talk to you a little bit about mentorship and the mentor-mentee relationship. What kind of role has it played in your life?
First of all, I think one concept that I want to make sure your listeners hear is the idea that you can and should have multiple mentors. Remember that you likely have multiple professional goals. Maybe some of those have to do with your specialty. Maybe some of those have to do with an area that is more general to medicine. Maybe some of them have to do with balancing your personal and professional lives. And you may have different mentors who you see as experts in those areas for your development. And that's definitely true in my own life. So Dr. Hamill has been an incredible mentor to me on a lot of fronts, from the infectious disease, from scholarship. He's also, some people talk about the difference between a mentor and a sponsor. Often a sponsor is someone who will be proactive in getting you towards your next level, right? So his inviting me to be a part of delivering this lecture is a means of sponsorship as a mentor or sponsor, because it's allowing me to sort of get up the ladder a little bit and engage in other experiences. However, Dr. Hamill is not the person that I would go to as my role model for work-life balance. So pull in Barbara Troutner, who's an expert in infectious diseases, particularly with regard to catheter-associated infections, ranging from the bench to translational science to implementation science. She really does it all. Plus, she's an incredible clinician and mother. And so this is where that comes into play, because I started working with her early on, even as a student. We worked on some scholarship together. And it was clear to me when we had meetings in her office, from the drawings and the cards that her children had produced, she was doing it right at home too.
So over the last many years now, you've trained and been part of the mentorship process with many residents, many medical students. If you were to highlight some of the key traits and habits of your most successful students, what would they be?
The word self-starter comes to mind. I'm not sure, there may be a better description there. Motivated and not afraid to make mistakes, to take chances and make mistakes. I think the student or the resident gets the most out of their experience when they are the driver. It's the same as active learning.
So for those of us who may not be the self-starters, who may not have the habit of taking the reins and being the driver and dictating, but still want to be successful, what would be your advice?
Then it's my role to push it. Okay, it's my role to be the nudger and the nagger and to really foster that. I think it is helping to just give a little bit of encouragement or like a specific task and helping them reach the next level. Same thing with like writing a protocol. If someone isn't necessarily offering that, hey, I guess the next step is to write the IRB, I may tell them, this is a great idea. The next step is to write it in a protocol. Here's an example. Go for it. It's a lot easier for me to refine their initial attempt. They shouldn't be afraid to make mistakes. It's fine. We'll come back and edit it.
So we've talked about a lot of amazing virtues. If I were to ask you to cone down to one thing that you wish you knew when you started residency or started medical school, what would that be?
This is going to sound really cheesy, but always bring it back to the patient. I think if you approach each day with the idea that you need to be able to look at yourself in the mirror at the end of the day and know that you did your best. That's not to say you didn't make a mistake. You may have prescribed a medication that a patient didn't need, or even, God forbid, that caused harm. You may have missed a diagnosis. But if you know that you tried your best, you gave it your all, then you're gonna rest easy at night. And that too kind of goes back to that, bringing it back to the patient and the human approach, because to truly be, we have to maintain intentionality about our successes. That is so important.
This was phenomenal, Dr. Rose. I'm so appreciative of you taking the time to share all this wisdom with us. I'm going to really try to summarize what I've learned from you into a couple of points that I think I can start to apply out of the so many things that you shared with us. I'd say the first thing that I really liked is celebrating success, being intentional about marking our success. And I think that's critical. And it's maybe the fastest working antidote to burnout that we're seeing today. I think the second thing that you talked about, which really struck me, is finding a mentor and not being shy to reach out, something that you've done through building a network of mentors. But identifying mentors for different aspects of life, where one mentor is not the solution to every problem, but it's about finding a series of mentors, and most importantly, not being afraid to reach out. The third thing that I liked is every time we face failure, stress, problems, it doesn't matter if it's administrative, clinical, bring it back to the patient. And I'll call that the mantra, the single source of truth. If we can remember that, bringing it back to the patient, how am I helping the patient? Then a lot of the interpersonal conflicts, the ego striking, a lot of that will automatically melt away. So this was phenomenal, and I'm honored and grateful that you took the time to share all this with us. To our audience, thank you for tuning in with us here on the Medicine Mentors. Thank you for joining us as we learn from the masters of medicine.